Well, with us now are Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, who's advised the IMF and the World Bank, Gillian Tett from the Financial Times, and Hugh Hendry, who runs the Eclectica Asset Management Hedge Fund. We're heading for a banking crisis, Gillian Tett?
We're not in a banking crisis yet, but certainly the atmosphere is getting very nervous in the markets. And for all the reasons that your film just explained, that basically many investors are saying that they can't tell what the level of exposure and risk is in the European banking system. And so just as they worried about the American banking system with subprime loans 2 years ago, they're worrying right now about the European banking system.
How does it look to you, Professor Sachs?
Well, clearly there's a lot of worry and there's a lot of uncertainty, but markets also have a way of jumping to conclusions and suddenly saying, well, they're not going to pay, it's all going to be restructured, looking at worst case scenarios, and I don't think that we're anywhere close to the worst cases of sovereign defaults at this point.
So this is just the market being too panicky?
Well, I think the market is panicky by nature, and I think that there is uncertainty, so the downsides could happen, but I don't think they're inevitable.
Okay, panicker, panic.
I would recommend you panic.
Really?
The European banking system is in crisis. Banks today are refusing to lend to each other. You know, that's a reality. Bank share prices are collapsing, and we have no ability to gauge the credit worthiness of the banking sector.
Well, if you're right, you're very pessimistic, you're alarmed, you're sanguine up to a point.
Exactly.
But let's suppose there is a banking crisis. The question then is what you do about it, isn't it? I mean, do you let banks go to the wall, or what's the sensible thing to do?
I think something you need to probably do right now is start talking about or considering the reality that you may need to restructure Greece, that you may not be able to repay the debts of Greece in full, and you need to also press the European and the German and French banks in particular to start coming clean.
Just explain what you mean. When you say restructure Greece, you mean restructure the Greek debt, and that means what?
One of the concerns right now is a lot of Greek debt is sitting with French and German banks. And although this enormous 750 billion euro package essentially has bought Greece time for the next 2 or 3 years, when that package comes to an end, the concern is that Greece still won't be able to repay, and it's better to bite the bullet now and face reality.
Would you don't pay them?
Yes.
Don't pay, right? Don't reward folly. The banking sector is responsible for gross folly, right? When you bring on a professor and when you bring on a politician, they are unaccountable. If Jeffrey's wrong, you know what? He will survive in tenure. If I'm wrong, I'll go bankrupt, right? Who do you want to bet with?
So you say you let the banks go to the wall?
I say let's purge this system of its rottenness. Let's take on a recession. It's going to be tough. People are going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose their jobs anyway. We can spread this over 20 years, or we can get rid of it over 3 years.
And you get rid of it over 3 years by purging the banks that have made bad judgments?
Indeed, by having honesty. You make a mistake, you pay for it.
All right. I don't know what... I won't inquire about your tenure or otherwise, but what is your reaction to that? Why can't you do that?
I find it really an incredible exaggeration that an issue that wasn't even on the radar screen 2 months ago, all of a sudden the only solution is the most draconian one that one can think about. And this is the kind of mass jumping to one corner, bouncing off the walls. It's got to be this, it's got to be that, that is completely, in my view, without foundation.
The nature of the response of government so far has been to turn a banking crisis, though, into a sovereign debt crisis. Well, that's what's happened.
Of course, there are big deficits. They need to be brought under control. That's what happens when governments run up big deficits. You bring them under control. The conclusion from that you therefore must default on your debt is really a jump that is unworthy.
So you say, well, however stupid these banks have been...
Well, and the country itself, the government that borrowed too much, found itself with a large deficit. It's time to get the deficits under control. That's for sure. I think there's no doubt about that. Greece needs an austerity program. So does the United States. So does the United Kingdom. Let's do that right now. That's what economic adjustment is. That's responsible policy. Greece has started that, and that's what I think should be given time to play out rather than jumping to the conclusion that all is lost, that it's all a disaster, purge the system.
Have we got the time?
Well, the problem is, in the last few years...
Well, how long have we been at this? How long has this Greek question been on the table? About 10 weeks, maybe?
I mean, I don't know, was Jeffrey skiing 2 months ago? Because I was working and Gillian was working, right? So we can tell you about the real world, because it doesn't go back 2 months ago.
That's just a very low
This is
blow.
preposterous. To say that this started 10 weeks ago is ridiculous. The height of absurdity, right?
I'm talking about the market reactions right
speculators
now. So
just watch your rhetoric speculators who are engaged to be alert to dangers in the market. We're calling for these potential threats to the viability of the system last year, not 10 weeks ago.
Something we learned in America is that when the government uses sticking plaster solutions and tries to sweep the problems under the carpet, it doesn't really work. I mean, at the end of the day, the American government had to come in and do what it vowed it would never do, and use taxpayers' money to shore up the banking system, and to go in and do a proper audit of the American banks. Wasn't perfect, but was a good start.
I'm not against that. We're talking about sovereign default. I'm sorry, we're talking about a different issue, and that is an extreme measure that at this point is unwarranted, especially when countries have started austerity measures. That's all.
But the problem is right now that by avoiding talking about it, even considering it, and by essentially letting the risk of default fester on the European banks' balance sheets, you're continuing in Europe to sweep the problems under the carpet.
No one's talking about sweeping problems under the carpet. Indeed, very tough austerity programs have started. It's hardly being swept under the carpet. But to go from the idea that there's a risk of default to let's get it over with now is really jumping to a remarkable conclusion.
But do you think that in 3 years' time, Greece is going to be able to repay its debt? Because if you look at the numbers...
I think that there's a reasonable chance of that, of course. It's not repay its debt, it's service its debt. It's become a normal market participant again. Absolutely, there's a reasonable chance of that.
And what do you all make of the European proposals today, that somehow there be a mechanism funded by the banks to get them out of trouble in future, or possibly to get governments that have got to bail them out of trouble?
Well, it's certainly welcome that they're starting to try and address the issue of moral hazard. I mean, the problem, though, that is weighing on the markets right now is a much more immediate one about what's going to happen both with Greece and the transparency.
I think what your Chancellor said is correct, that there ought to be a tax on the banks and it ought to go to the general revenues.
I find it, irrelevant. I find it astonishing that there's no political will to do more to sort out the banks. Banks should not be paying dividends when there's this issue of solvency. They should have far tougher capital.
How do you stop them?
It's called legislation.
It's regulation. I agree with that. Yeah. This is a regulatory matter.
So you would legislate to stop banks paying dividends?
Until they reached a Tier 1 capital ratio, so until they had a buffer, a security zone, if you will, to look after their own affairs. I would insist that they require 20% equity to their loans outstanding, rather than the ratio of 8 today.
Regulators have a lot of authority when banks are undercapitalized to get their banks back into shape, and I think that prudential standards like this are absolutely appropriate. And that's a normal part of banking in the event of a crisis, to help get the balance sheets balanced again. But I don't think we need to go all the way to the great Armageddon.
Well, let's hope you're right. Thanks very much.